Welcome to the NANB webinar on the standards for the nurse-client relationship. These standards support the nurse-client relationship, a foundational block on which nursing practice is built. They are intended to complement NANB's standards of practice for registered nurses and the standards for the practice of primary healthcare nurse practitioners by providing more specific direction to nurses regarding the establishment, limits, maintenance, and termination of the nurse-client relationship. The purpose of this webinar is to familiarize members with the new nurse-client relationship standards. This webinar will be approximately 15 minutes. In this presentation, we will go over the principles and components of the nurse-client relationship and look at each of the standards for the nurse-client relationship. We will discuss the differences between a professional and personal relationship. I will also speak to accepting and receiving gifts and how and when to terminate the nurse-client relationship. Here are the principles of the nurse-client relationship. The nurse-client relationship may vary according to the setting, the type of nursing services provided, and the client's healthcare needs. For example, a nurse working in a long-term care facility would have a different relationship with their clients compared to a nurse in the emergency room. Nurses practice in accordance with legislation, regulatory standards, the Code of Ethics, and employer policies. The standards for the nurse-client relationship are intended to complement the NANB standards and the Code of Ethics by providing more specific direction to nurses regarding the establishment, limits, maintenance, and termination of the nurse-client relationship. Nurses are responsible for setting and maintaining boundaries regardless of a client or the setting in which the relationship occurs. Nurses are responsible and accountable for their own actions. This includes actions which result in outcomes that may have been unintended, but that should have been foreseen. Nurse-client relationships occur along a continuum of behavior, with the goal of providing care within the zone of helpfulness, as seen on this diagram. These are the 5 components of the nurse-client relationship. These components are always present in the relationship, regardless of the context of care. Power. The nurse-client relationship is one of unequal power. Although nurses may not perceive themselves as having power in the relationship, they have more power than the client. The power of the nurse comes from the authority associated with their position in the healthcare system, specialized knowledge, influence with other healthcare providers in the decision-making process, and access to privileged information. Trust. Clients expect nurses to have the knowledge and skills to provide safe, competent, ethical, and compassionate care. Trust is critical, as the client is in a vulnerable position in the relationship. Part of trust is keeping one's word. If trust is breached, then it becomes very difficult to reestablish it. Respect. Respect for the rights and diversity of the client is fundamental to the nurse-client relationship. Nurses demonstrate respect by acknowledging and taking into account a client's culture and other aspects of the client's individuality when providing care. Being respectful means being non-judgmental of the client and seeking to discover the meaning behind the client's behaviors. Professional intimacy. Professional intimacy relates to the activities nurses perform for and with the client, which create personal and private closeness on many levels. This can involve physical, emotional, and spiritual elements, including appropriate emotional distancing from the client to ensure objectivity and professionalism. This does not refer to sexual intimacy. Fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty refers to the nurse's duty to care and to act in the best interest of their clients. Nurses are to be aware of their values, needs, and behaviors, keeping personal needs separate from those of their clients. Standard 1 is client-centered care. The nurse collaborates with the client to ensure that all professional behaviors and actions meet the needs of the client. In accordance with this standard, the nurse reflects on their beliefs which may affect the nurse-client relationship, recognizes their competencies in forming the nurse-client relationship, and discloses any affiliations or conflicts of interest that may impact the care of the client. The nurse actively includes the client in their care by discussing client expectations, establishing roles within the relationship, respecting the client's choices, and engaging the client in the evaluation of their care. Standard 2 is maintaining boundaries. The nurse is responsible and accountable for establishing and maintaining boundaries in the nurse-client relationship. Boundaries are the defining lines which separate the therapeutic behavior of a nurse from any behavior which could reduce the benefit of nursing care to clients. They are the limits to the nurse-client relationship which allow for a safe and therapeutic connection between the nurse and the client. Standard 2 includes clarifying the nurse's role within the relationship, refraining from interfering with the client's personal relationships, abstaining from financial transactions, ensuring that care aims to improve the well-being of the client and not the nurse, and consulting with the supervisor or NANB when it is unclear whether a behavior may cross a boundary of the nurse-client relationship. Let's look at indicator 2.6 that states, the RN recognizes when the boundaries of the nurse-client relationship are at risk of being compromised. The nurse must recognize when boundaries of the nurse-client relationship are at risk of being compromised. However, the lines between acceptable behavior and boundary crossing may not always be clear. Appendixes C and D in the standards for the nurse-client relationship provide information to help nurses understand which behaviors are acceptable and which are not. Appendix C provides a list of warning signs regarding boundary crossing. Some examples include spending extra time with a client beyond therapeutic needs, disclosing personal problems to a client or to a client's significant other, or thinking about the client or their significant other frequently while away from work. If one or more of the warning signs is present in the nurse-client relationship, further assessment of all aspects of the relationship is needed to determine if professional boundaries are being crossed. Appendix D provides a decision tree to help determine if a behavior is appropriate or if it crosses the boundaries of the nurse-client relationship. The tool may also be useful for determining if a nurse should engage in or abstain from a behavior and whether or not to consult NANB for further guidance. Now let's talk more specifically to indicator 2.7 that states, the RN determines whether a particular activity or behavior is appropriate within the context of a nurse-client relationship. In some instances, the nurse may be required to care for family, friends, or acquaintances. This is likely to happen in small communities, but can happen in any practice setting. There are a number of factors to be considered in these situations. Input from the client. The client needs to have input about who provides their care. Some clients may not be comfortable with receiving nursing services from someone with whom they have a prior or existing relationship. Self-awareness and reflection. Nurses must reflect carefully on whether they can maintain objectivity in caring for a client and whether the relationship interferes with meeting the client's needs. It is necessary to ascertain that providing care to a family member or friend does not interfere with the care of other clients or with the dynamics of the healthcare team. Maintaining boundaries. Professional boundaries must be clearly set, ensuring the client understands that even though a family member or friend, the nurse is in a professional role. Nurses must refrain from using their power as a healthcare professional to gain access to more information than is required to provide safe care. Confidentiality. A nurse caring for family or friends needs to carefully consider issues of confidentiality, using caution to avoid revealing information about the client even after the nurse-client relationship ends. Information regarding providing care to family and friends can be found in Appendix E of the Standards for the Nurse-Client Relationship. Standard 3 is therapeutic communication. The nurse uses a wide range of communication strategies and interpersonal skills to establish, maintain, and terminate the nurse-client relationship. This standard includes addressing the client by their preferred name, adapting the communication style to meet the client's needs, advocating on the client's behalf, respecting the client's values, opinions, and needs, and planning for the termination of the nurse-client relationship. Standard 4 is protection from harm. The nurse protects the client from harm by ensuring that abuse is prevented or stopped and reported. To meet Standard 4, nurses must refrain from discrimination against the client, refrain from a personal relationship with the client or their significant other, refrain from activities which could result in monetary, personal, or material benefit, and intervene and report behaviors that may demonstrate disrespect or cause harm to the client. It is also important to remember that nurses have a duty to report in some circumstances. Under the Nurses Act, nurses have a duty to intervene and report situations when there is reasonable grounds to believe that another healthcare provider has sexually abused a client. Under the Family Services Act, the public and professionals such as nurses have a duty to report suspected cases of child abuse or neglect to the Department of Social Development. The Family Services Act also authorizes professionals such as nurses to disclose information to the Department of Social Development about suspected cases of adult abuse or neglect. This table shows the differences between a personal relationship and a professional relationship. It can be helpful when establishing boundaries and developing relationships with your clients. For example, the purpose of the professional relationship is goal-directed to provide care to clients. However, the purpose of the personal relationship is pleasure and interest-directed. The previous table continues on this slide and states that preparation for the professional relationship requires nurses to have formal knowledge, preparation, orientation, and training. However, there are no formal requirements for the preparation of the personal relationship. This table is available in Appendix A of the Standards for the Nurse-Client Relationship. Nurses should abstain from accepting gifts at the risk of being in conflict of interest unless, in rare instances, the refusal will harm the nurse-client relationship. When considering accepting a gift from a client, the nurse should consider employer policy on giving and/or receiving of gifts, whether the client is mentally competent, the client's intent and expectation in offering the gift, that is, will the client expect anything in return, or will the nurse feel a special obligation to that client over others? The appropriateness of the timing, for example, on discharge versus Valentine's Day. The potential for negative feelings on the part of other clients who may not be able to or choose not to give gifts. The monetary value and appropriateness of the gift, and whether accepting the gift would change the dynamics of the therapeutic relationship. Gift giving may be acceptable when it is part of the therapeutic plan or approach for the client. It is given from a corporation or an agency. The client is clear that the nurse does not expect a gift in return. It does not change the dynamics of the relationship between the nurse and the client. It does not affect the relationship that other nurses have with the client, and it has no potential for negative feelings on the part of other clients. The nurse may decide to terminate the relationship prior to the end of the episode of care when they are unable to provide safe, competent, ethical, and compassionate care. Nurses are required to use reasonable efforts in attempting to resolve any issues affecting their relationship with the client prior to any final decision. Reasonable efforts include discussing with the client the elements that are necessary for a nurse-client relationship and the situations affecting the nurse's ability to provide quality care. If nurses are uncertain whether or not it is professionally acceptable to end a nurse-client relationship, they are advised to contact NANB and/or the Canadian Nurses Protective Society. Trust and respect are essential elements in a nurse-client relationship. Situations in which there is a breakdown of trust between the nurse and the client may result in a decision to end a nurse-client relationship while the client still requires care. This may occur when there has been client fraud, such as for the purpose of obtaining narcotics or other drugs, prescription fraud, such as a client changing information on a nurse practitioner's prescription, serious threat of harm to the nurse, other forms of inappropriate behavior, including foul language or rudeness, and/or a conflict of interest that compromises the nurse's ability to provide nursing care. If you have specific questions regarding these standards, please contact NANB at practiceconsultation@nanb.nb.ca. Thank you for listening to this webinar. I hope it has enhanced your knowledge on the standards for the nurse-client relationship.